name is Cole, if I haven't met you personally. Today we're going to be talking about undesigned coincidences and how they increase gospel reliability. So, you might ask, Cole, what is an undesigned coincidence? Lydia McGrew defines in her book titled Hidden in Plain View, she states, an undesigned coincidence is a notable connection between two or more accounts or texts that doesn't seem to have been planned by the person or people giving the accounts. Despite their apparent independence, the items fit together like a piece of a puzzle. So, just suppose, for example, there's an instance of a bank robbery, right? The police come, they start interviewing witnesses. There's these two witnesses, so they go up to the first witness, and they start talking to them, and they ask, what happened? The witness starts telling them what's going on, and then the witness proceeds to tell them that, hey, I saw the robber, and his shoe was untied. Cool, blah, 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 keep going. They go to the next witness, and the second witness, giving a similar story about the things that took place. And then he's like, yeah, whenever the robber was fleeing the scene, I saw him trip. So you have these two independent statements from eyewitnesses that neither of them both said that confirm the truthfulness of their testimony and accurately records the events that took place in the case of the robbery. So, I urge, if you're skeptical here, to take serious the hypothesis that the Gospels are historical biographies of real people and events written by those in a position to know, either as eyewitnesses or friends of the eyewitnesses, who are trying to be truthful in their recording of history. So, supposing the Gospels were biographies, we must ask ourselves, what might they look like? How is their report gonna, be laid out? What are they gonna say? How does the occurrence of coincidences that appear casual, unrehearsed, between and among these documents support the hypothesis? Casual comments, allusions, and omissions that fit together are not what you would find in works that are made up, fictionalized, lies, later historical developments. So, they are the sort of things that you get in real eyewitness testimony from people who are close to the real events. When commenting on the undesigned coincidences in the New Testament, J. Warner Wallace states, he was a homicide detective. If anybody doesn't know who he is, he wrote a book, The Cold Case for Christianity, and he says, as a cold case detective, I've experienced something similar to this a number of times. Often, questions an eyewitness raises at the time of a crime are left unanswered until we locate an additional witness years later. This is a common characteristic of true, reliable eyewitness accounts, and it is my job to assemble the complete picture of what happened at the scene. No single witness is likely to have seen every detail, so I must piece together the accounts, allowing the observations of one eyewitness to fill in the gaps that may exist in the observation of other eyewitnesses. True, reliable eyewitness accounts are never completely parallel and identical. Instead, they are different pieces of the same puzzle, unintentionally supporting and complementing each other to provide all the details related to what really happened. So, just two things to keep in mind before we start to hop into the specific examples. One is that this argument is cumulative, so the reliability of the Gospels increase when instance after instance these documents fit together the same way truthful eyewitness testimony fits together. And then two, the argument is varied in strength. Some of the cases that we're going to talk about tonight are going to be easier to explain away than others. One of them you might not be that compelled by. You're maybe this doesn't increase the reliability of the text that much, but remember, it's cumulative. So one example isn't what the Gospel's reliability hinges on. So also, in order to appreciate undesigned coincidences in the Gospels, you do not have to decide whether Mark wrote first, Matthew wrote first, or any of the puzzles that surround Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, known as the Synoptic Gospels. This evidence gives us reasons to trust all four Gospels because undesigned coincidences uniquely confirm the reliability of each of them. Even the two that resemble each other the most, Matthew and Mark, have undesigned coincidences that couldn't have arisen from copying between them, and this is a reason to believe that they are reliable and into an important degree independent. So, we'll hop into the first undesigned coincidence. The first one we'll look at is titled, "He Was Before Me." So, in John's Gospel, in John chapter 1, verses 14 through 18, it states, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. The glory is of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about him and cried out, 'This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me.'" This important phrase, remember it. And then continuing on, he says, "For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, the only God who is at the Father's side, he has made him known." Amen. John's Gospel draws special attention to the statement about Jesus. "He who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me." So let's just think about this. In the context of John, this seems to support the theological idea that Jesus pre-existed before his earthly life. But the statement itself is somewhat puzzling, since John never explains why it couldn't simply refer to age. Like, sitting here thinking about it, he was before me, maybe Jesus is just older than John. But the missing piece of information to make sense of the statement shows up independently in Luke's Gospel. In Luke chapter 1, verse 26, it states, "In the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, Jesus sent the angel Gabriel to Nazareth, a town in Galilee." So, this explains that John the Baptist was actually born about 6 months before Jesus. So this means Jesus truly came after John in both birth and ministry. So the claim that he was before John cannot refer to age, but instead it naturally points to Jesus' pre-existence. The key point here is that neither gospel explicitly connects these dots. John assumes the statement's significance without explaining it, while Luke provides the background detail without drawing out its theological implications. So, this subtle and unintended fit between the two accounts is the undesigned coincidence, and it suggests that both the authors are working from real historical information rather than just inventing some story. So, like the skeptic might look at you and be like, so what? What if John just, took John the Baptist as his mouthpiece and started putting whatever he wanted to make him say in it? Maybe he was just he has a theological motive that he was trying to force onto the historical events. And it's like, sure, I'll respond to the skeptic and be like, sure, maybe John could have done that. Maybe John could have colluded and came up with a statement that Jesus was before John the Baptist. But if he did, it would be very strange to make the meaning so obscure and depend on a detail he never explains. Because if John was about to make up this detail about what John the Baptist says, and then not include the birth narrative of John the Baptist and Jesus, then we begin to start wondering, is John an idiot, or is it John being truthful? So, but what happens whenever you put the two accounts together, you get, this suddenly becomes clear. Luke explains why John's words cannot refer to age, and John shows the deeper meaning. So, the next one we'll hop into is titled, "Why Were the Water Pots Empty?" So, we will be looking at the story of Jesus turning water into wine in John's Gospel. In John chapter 2, verses 1 through 7, it states, "On the 3rd day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, 'They have no wine.' And Jesus said to her, 'Woman, What does this have to do with me? My hour has not come yet. Man, Jesus makes me laugh sometimes. His mother said to his servants, do whatever he tells you. Now there were 6 stone water jars, there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to his servants, fill the jars with water, and they filled them to the brim. So, the miracle of Jesus turning water into wine doesn't occur in any of the other Gospels. So the explanation for why John offhandedly mentions the detail about them being empty cannot be found in another Gospel's account of the same instance. So, however, both Mark and Matthew mention a separate instance in which the Pharisees challenge Jesus and his disciples because they are not ritually pure. They do not follow the, quote, traditions of the elders. They eat their food with unwashed hands. So, Mark, apparently with the Gentile audience in mind, goes into detail about the reason for this accusation. In Mark chapter 7, verses 1 through 5, it states, now when the Pharisees had gathered to him with some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem, they saw that some of his disciples ate with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. For the Pharisees and the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, holding to the traditions of the elders. And when they have come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they have washed. And there are many other traditions that they observe, such as the washing of cups and pots, copper vessels, and dining couches. And the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, why do your disciples not walk according to the traditions of the elders, but eat with defiled hands? So, in a different context, we get an explanation for why the pots at Cana are empty. The pots were for the wedding guests to wash before eating and drinking at the feast, and they were now empty. So we have John, who is getting on with the story he's telling. He's mentioning and implying details in passing that make sense when you understand the story with the backdrop of the independent information from Mark. So let's just take a step back. The argument from undesigned coincidences is cumulative. We must continually ask ourselves, what would we expect truthful eyewitness testimony to look like? If John is an eyewitness, then we should expect him to get the little details correct when he is recounting the story. If John is just making up stories, then it seems to be incredibly unlikely that he would include unexplained casual details without, really fleshing them out and their significance of them. So, hopping into the next undesigned coincidence, Lady McGrew titles it, Are You the King of the Jews? So, in John's account of Jesus being transferred from the custody of the Jewish leaders to Pilate, he paints a vivid scene. Pilate asked them what accusations they bring against Jesus, and they answer unhelpfully. If this man were not doing evil, we would have not delivered him over to you. John 18:30. Pilate urges them to judge Jesus according to their own law, since he assumed the matters concerned some disputation or violation of Jewish law. But they reply in a frankly bloodthirsty manner that they are not authorized to put anyone to death, whereupon Pilate reluctantly re-enters his palace and questions Jesus. Not a word is said in the John's account that gives of an accusation of treason or any other political accusations against Jesus. But then Pilate confronts Jesus, and in John's Gospel, the first thing he asks him is, are you the King of the Jews? Which is verse 33. So the question we have to ask ourselves, why does Pilate ask this if John's account tells us all that the Jewish leaders have said against Jesus? Why would Pilate even think that Jesus claimed to be the King of the Jews? It's just a strange question given the accusations alone in John. Again, our boy Luke just comes in to save the day. The Gospel of Luke alone answers this question. In Luke chapter 23, verses 1 through 3, it says, and the whole company of them arose and brought him before Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, we found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king. And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered them, "You have said so." So, Luke's sources evidently indicate that the Jewish leaders accused Jesus of treason, prompting Pilate to intervene in the case. It is worth emphasizing Luke's uniqueness in this respect because Matthew and Mark also have a similar scene in which Jesus is handed over to Pilate, who asks Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" They do not, however, record that the Jewish leaders accused Jesus of treason. They just merely give unspecific accusations that were thrown upon Jesus. Luke is therefore adding details to this part of the story in some way independently of earlier Gospels, even if we consider him to have been relied in some measure on Matthew and Mark. A skeptic might try to point out to you, man, like you're saying there's these differences, well, they just contradict. Luke is in contradiction with John, but there is no reason to think this unless you insist on taking them to be both complete accounts of everything that was said between Pilate and Jesus' accusers. But why should we think this? Like, come on, this is absurd. Like, you think they recorded every single sentence they had together? You know, witnesses do not always give complete accounts. Rather, they often give accounts of what struck them or what they considered most interesting to mention at that time. It is entirely possible that the accounts, that the accuser said both what John gives and what Luke gives. At first, they grumbled to Pilate that they would have not brought Jesus here unless he was an evildoer. But upon Pilate trying to refuse the case and give it back to them, just like, go on, get out of my way, to judge according to their own laws, they made the more inflammatory accusation of treason, which would bring a sentence of death from the Roman authorities if it is upheld. So, this undesigned coincidence shows you that you need Luke to make sense of Pilate's question to Jesus found in John. The fact that the accounts fit together with Luke explaining John is both evidence of the account's truthfulness along with showing their nearness to the historical facts. The next one we'll look at is titled, "What Happened in Malchus's Ear?" In John chapter 18, we have a scene, most of you probably know it, where Peter cuts off the ear of the high priest's servant. John says nothing more about what happened to the servant, for all the reader knows is that he went away bleeding and left with one ear. This makes the following detail recounted in John all the more interesting. A few verses later, in John chapter 18, Jesus assures Pilate that his kingdom is not of this world, and he gives the following argument for the unworldly nature of his kingdom. Jesus answers Pilate in John 18:36, saying, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from this world." John 18:36. Obviously, this is confusing. If you're the reader, given the scene prior of Peter cutting off the high priest's ear, like you gotta be thinking to yourself, like, Jesus, what are you saying? One of your disciples just cut off somebody's ear. Had Pilate inquired into Jesus' claim of unworldly peacefulness, couldn't somebody have just brought Malchus, bloody and earless, as evidence for the hostility of Jesus' disciples and of his movement? So we have to ask ourselves, why? Based on John, would Jesus make this argument, knowing that such evidence could be produced against him? The answer, again, only found in Luke's Gospel. In Luke chapter 22, verses 47 through 53, Jesus rebukes the actions of Peter and heals Malchus. Luke supplies the unique detail in the passage that is, in some respects, similar to those of the other synoptic Gospels. And here too, this detail is confirmed by the undesigned coincidence. If it is true that Jesus healed the servant's ear, then that would explain Jesus' words to Pilate. Though those words are only recorded in John. Jesus could confidently stand in front of Pilate and declare that his kingdom is not of this world, and even say that if his kingdom was of this world, his servants would have been fighting. If anyone tries to say, yo, Peter cut off the servant's ear, like, yo, look at that, the wounded servant himself could not be produced to show this. And an admission that Jesus healed the ear would be further evidence of Jesus' nonviolent intentions, not to mention evidence of his miraculous capabilities. Another one we'll look at, going along with the same story, is in John 18:10 again, is titled Insider Information. John 18:10, John says Peter strikes the ear of the high priest's servant, and then he adds, almost in passing, that the servant's name was Malchus. That is a little unusual because Malchus is not some major figure in John's gospel. John does not explain why he knows the name, nor does he make it seem important. Then, in John 18:36, John adds another small detail. One of the people questioning Peter in the courtyard was a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off. Well, he was a relative of Malchus. This means the questioning was not random. Someone in the courtyard personally knew the injured servant and recognized Peter as the man from the garden. The third passage we're looking at is John 18:15 through 16, where Jesus says to the other disciples, the other disciple was known to the high priest, allowing him to enter the courtyard and bring Peter in. This is the key. John never directly says, yo, this is how I know the name of Malchus and his relatives. But the author of the gospel, if the author of the Gospel of John was this, quote, other disciple, then he would have access to the high priest's household and would possibly know Malchus, who Malchus was, his relative, and how this courtyard scene unfolded. This is the undesigned coincidence. The passage does not say, yo, here's how I know this. Instead, John gives little details in different places that quietly fit together. John claims he knows Malchus, claims he knows his relatives, and then elsewhere says this, quote, other disciple knew the high priest. Whenever you put these things together, they suggest that the author of the Gospel of John had insider information. The Gospel never advertises this connection, which is exactly why it feels natural. If someone were just inventing this material, you would expect a more obvious explanation. And instead, the details are scattered, casual, and only make full sense whenever you read deeper and connect them yourself. So, getting on some of my favorite undesigned coincidences, they come from the story, The Feeding of the 5,000. This one is titled, Many Were Coming and Going. So, the Gospel of Mark introduces the feeding of the 5,000 by telling of Jesus' attempts to get away from the crowd with his disciples after the 12 had returned from a preaching mission. In Mark chapter 6, verses 30 through 31, it states, the apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest for a while. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure to even eat. So, at first glance, this reference to coming and going could just be merely another allusion to the fact that Jesus was often followed by crowds. Mark says nothing more about the busyness around them, but the phrase, however, is slightly odd based on Jesus' popularity alone, and I will show why there's a better explanation. The Gospel of John introduces the feeding of the 5,000 in chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. He states, after this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias, and a large crowd was following him, because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. So John notes that a large cloud followed him across the sea, but he doesn't mention this phrase, many were coming and going, the same way Mark does. Rather, he gives us an important piece of information, the time of the year, which was Passover. So, in his work titled The War of the Jews, the first century historian Josephus tells us of an estimate of almost 3 million Jews in Jerusalem for Passover during the reign of Nero. So let's think about this. Mark offhandedly mentioned that there were many people coming and going. John mentions it is Passover, and Josephus gives us the important historical backdrop to affirm both details. Again, I want to point out the independence of these mentions. Mark doesn't say that many were coming and going because it was the Passover. And John, if John was just copying from Mark while he was making up a random version of the story himself, he doesn't mention this either, that there's a connection between the many people coming and going and the fact that it is Passover. So, on top of this, we have an extra biblical statement from Josephus that perfectly aligns with the two accounts. And this gives us good reasons to think that the gospel authors are in a position, historically, geographically, to accurately report the facts. So, the next one we'll look at pertains to the same story, feeding of the 5,000, and it's titled Green Grass. So, Matthew, Mark, and John all mention that there was grass where this occurred, but only Mark emphasizes the color. In Mark chapter 6, verse 39, he states, "Then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass." We must ask ourselves, why does Mark specifically mention the grass was green? The answer is found again in the previous passage that we just looked at from John 6:4, saying the Passover was at hand. For the background context, the grass is not genuinely green in this region, but is green in the spring after the winter rains, which is around the time of the Passover. So there would need to be quite a lot of green grass to make Mark's statement true. Since he implies that more than 5,000 people sat down on it. Only at that time of year could such an abundance of green grass be possible. Abundance of green grass be possible. So here we have a perfect fit between John's casual reference to the time of the year, Mark's specific detail about the color of the grass, and again, I invite us all to ask ourselves, what would we expect if they were true historical reportages from people who are in a position to know what is taking place? And then the last one, which we'll look at tonight, it surrounds the same story as well, as titled, Why Ask Philip? So I feel like some of you may have already heard this before in your lives, but it's a super interesting idea. Again, another undesigned coincidence is found in the story in John chapter 6, verses 1 through 5. It states, Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. The Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand, and lifting up his eyes and seeing that a large crowd was coming towards him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" At first glance, you might ask me, what's so strange here, Cole? But the detail about Philip, I think, personally, is worth questioning. Why Philip? Why not one of the other disciples? Why not one of the members of the inner three, who were Peter, James, John? Why not the group treasurer, who was Judas Iscariot, who took care of the money for the group? Why Peter? Why Philip? You may say it's just random bull. There's no meaning behind it, but I think there's a better explanation. As we recall, the feeding of the 5,000 takes place in a town called Bethsaida, or near a town called Bethsaida, and you see in Luke chapter 9, verse 10. Also, from looking at John chapter 1, verses 43 and 44, we learn from that passage that Philip is from Bethsaida. John does not give the location of the feeding, but only John reports that Jesus asked Philip where to buy bread. Now, to be clear, I'm not implying that Jesus was being serious. If you just read the story yourself, the Gospel of John, you see that John mentions that he asked Philip to test him. But, as we all know, Jesus often says cryptic things or asks people's questions to try to draw out the response as part of his own teaching. So one can even just picture Jesus in this scenario asking the question in a slightly teasing manner. The fact that Philip was from this area makes the question and the joke more pointed. If Philip is from the nearby town, Jesus is in essence saying, "Philip, you're from around here. Where can we buy bread for these people?" Now, when we put these passages together, it makes sense. We can make sense of why Jesus asked Philip where to buy bread. The beginning of John's Gospel gives us the necessary background information from where Philip was from. Luke provides the location of the event that John's account does not. And both of these things explains why Jesus asked Philip specifically. This shows that John's account of the event does not fit together, or does fit together in a casual way with the Synoptic Gospels. So, as we've seen throughout the lecture, the Gospel accounts don't read like carefully engineered stories where every detail is perfectly explained. Instead, they read like real testimony, partial, selective, and yet deeply interconnected. Small details are left unexplained in one place, only to be clarified in another. Questions arise in one account that are quietly answered in another account, often without any indication that the authors are even aware of this connection. And that is exactly the point. Just for reference, this argument took like 1,800 years for people to even like notice some of these connections. They first get started with William Paley in the 1800s, and Lydia McGrew has furthered the argument in her recent book. If these people were trying to engineer these stories, they did a horrible job because it took forever for people to figure them out. But like I said, if these were fictionalized or heavily edited works, we would expect tighter storytelling. We would expect the authors to smooth out the difficulties in the text, to explain confusing statements, and to make sure every important detail is clearly tied together. But that's not what we find when we read the Gospels. Instead, we find the kind of casual, unforced agreement that we typically associate with truthful eyewitness accounts. Independent perspectives that, when brought together, form a coherent picture of what really happened. We also, as I just keep bashing into y'all said, the argument is cumulative. Lydia McGrew lays out like 25 in her book, and I just only shared with y'all 8. So you could explain away any single coincidence, but as we've seen again and again, these patterns repeat. Across different events, different authors, and different types of details, the Gospels consistently fit together in ways that are subtle, natural, and unintended. So we must ask this question as we walk away tonight: what is the best explanation for these stories we find in the Gospels? Is it that multiple authors writing at different times somehow managed to create a dozen of subtle, interlocking details without over-explaining them or making the connections obvious? Or is it that these accounts were rooted in real events, preserved by people who were close enough to the facts to report them truthfully? Undesigned coincidences don't prove everything about the Gospels, but they do give us good reasons to trust that we are dealing with sources that are historically grounded, connected to eyewitness testimony, and concerned with telling the truth about what actually happened. And if that is the case, then the Gospels are not just theological documents, they are windows into real history.